say or ask any questions or anything you want me to cut out, just let me know at the end of the class and I will do that. I guess I should also mention too that the recordings are posted on Canvas now. Hopefully you've seen that. So if you go to like the homepage on Canvas, there's like a YouTube link that you can click and that'll take you to the playlist for this class where all of the recordings can be found there. So if you've missed anything or if you just want to review them, you can find them there. Any questions about any of that before I get started? Okay. All right, so like I said, today first to start, we're going to be talking about mood disorders. So some of the main things I want you to take away from today. So mood disorders, maybe obviously from the name, are going to be characterized by extremes in either high or low moods. So that's really what sort of classifies or brings all of these disorders together into one category. The most common one, which we'll talk about first, is called major depressive disorder. So that's the most common mood disorder. And again, probably the name gives away a lot about what that disorder is. Essentially someone who's suffering from extreme depression for a particular amount of time. So we'll talk about some of the symptoms of that disorder and, you know, like what criteria has to be met in order to be diagnosed. Mood disorders almost always require some sort of medication to treat them effectively. So we'll talk about treatment methods that are used, but you'll see medications are very common, and then of course different types of psychotherapy can be used as well. All right, so to start, we're going to be talking about the depressive disorders. There are two main depressive disorders that I want to make sure we all know about. That's major depressive disorder and persistent depressive disorder. The symptoms for both of these are going to be very similar. The main difference is just going to be in the duration that they last. So major depressive disorders tend to be shorter, whereas persistent depressive disorder is going to last for at least 2 years that someone will be suffering from these symptoms. Some of the symptoms include obviously things like mood disturbances, behavioral issues, cognitive disruptions, and physical changes. So there's kind of these 4 different categories of symptoms. Some of those might be kind of self-explanatory, but with mood disturbances, again, as the name implies, it's almost always going to be a depressed mood. So people are going to have like extreme sadness. They also will suffer from something called anhedonia, which is essentially where they no longer get pleasure from the activities they used to find enjoyable. So if they used to really like, you know, gardening or cooking or whatever it might be, once they're suffering from major depressive disorder, they no longer find those things to kind of bring them the pleasure that it used to. They also will have behavioral issues, so they might have decreases in physical activity. They might have a hard time maintaining social interactions. It may also cut into like their work and their school performance because they, you know, may not even be able to get out of bed, or if they can get out of bed, they might not have the motivation to go and do the things that they're supposed to do. People with depressive disorders can also suffer from cognitive disruptions. So they may have kind of like a brain fog, basically, or decreased concentration. It can even impact their memory. So there's cognitive disruptions that accompany it as well. And then often people who are suffering from these depressive disorders will have physical changes as well. So they may have changes in weight. Often you'll get kind of one of the extreme end of weight, sleep, etc. So they might eat more than usual or less than usual. So you can get them either gaining weight or losing weight. They may sleep more than usual, or they may not be able to sleep at all. So there will be disruptions in some of those physical things, but it can go to kind of either extreme. So in order to be diagnosed with one of these depressive disorders, for major depressive disorder, they have to have at least 5 symptoms across those 4 categories that we just talked about. So that's kind of one of the criteria that has to be checked off. They have to have at least 5 of those symptoms. One of the symptoms has to be the depressed mood or lack of pleasure. So they have to have at least that one and then 4 others. And then their symptoms have to be present for at least 2 weeks, and it has to cause significant distress in their life in some way. So again, that might be in their social lives, in their work lives, their academic lives, etc. But it has to cause them some kind of, you know, pronounced distress. Persistent depressive disorder, like I said, is going to be pretty much the same symptoms, but the difference is in the duration. So they have to have those symptoms persisting pretty much most of the day for at least 2 years. They may, yes, did you have a question?
Someone who suffers from, like, not suffers, but like is in recovery from like addiction, which one is most like lead to occur?
We'll talk about comorbidities in just a second, but in general, I'd say probably someone who's, so in recovery from depression, you're asking, are they more likely to suffer from major depressive?
In
or
recovery from like addiction.
And you're asking if they're more likely to suffer from major depressive or persistent depressive? I'm not sure off the top of my head. I don't have that statistic as far as like which of these would be more common. I would guess probably major depressive disorder would be more common just because it's a shorter length of time. So that would be my guess, but I don't know that like for fact off the top of my head. Good question though. So yeah, so persistent depressive disorder, like I said, lasts usually for about 2 years. They may have breaks in their depression, so it's not necessarily that they're depressed literally for 2 years straight. They may have bouts of depression that last for months at a time and then have a break for a period. But the overall idea is that it lasts for quite a while, for at least 2 years. One of the depressive disorders I don't have listed here, but I just wanted to mention it, is premenstrual dysphoric disorder. That's basically where someone who menstruates suffers from depression symptoms, usually in like the days leading up to menses or to their period. And then usually those symptoms resolve, while they're on their period or shortly thereafter. And it's kind of similar, in terms of the extreme of the symptoms. So a lot of women or people who menstruate might have, kind of low mood during that time, but they have to kind of tick off again, multiple symptoms in order to be classified as suffering from that disorder. So those are the depressive disorders. Any other questions about those before we move on to talking about bipolar disorder? We'll talk about treatment and stuff in just a second, but here we're just talking about basic criteria for diagnosis. All right, so next are the bipolar and bipolar-related disorders. So bipolar we typically classify as either 1 or 2, so bipolar 1 or bipolar 2. The main sort of thing that characterizes bipolar disorder are these episodes of mania. And mania is essentially where someone has an extremely high mood, so it's very kind of the opposite of depression in a lot of ways. So someone who is in a manic episode, they often will be very hyperactive, they'll have lots of energy, they might not sleep very much, they might go multiple days without sleeping at all. They may be also very irritable during that time, so they can be really like euphoric and happy, but they can also like very quickly snap to sort of an irritable state. They will also sometimes have kind of like grandiose visions of themselves. At extreme ends, they might even see themselves as like a god. They often will engage in very impulsive behaviors and often do things without any sort of planning. So they might, for example, decide that they want to sell their house and move across the country without putting any thought or anything into it. And they might think that they're capable of handling that because they have these very grandiose visions of themselves. Let's see, what else? Let me see if I skipped anything. They can also have, changes in their social interactions as well. They may become very overly sexual and more extroverted than they normally would be. And like I said, their mood might kind of fluctuate between like very extreme euphoric and irritable. So someone with bipolar disorder, in order to sort of meet that diagnosis, they basically just have to have just the manic episode. And they don't necessarily have like a depressive episode that's following or preceding that. So they may be kind of like quote unquote normal baseline and then have a manic episode and then return to kind of baseline. Although oftentimes they might also have sort of a depressed mood as well. Bipolar 2 disorder is where someone has the manic episode and they sort of fluctuate or yo-yo back and forth between the manic and the depressive episode. So the depressive episode here would have all the same symptoms we just talked about with major depressive disorder. It's just it's also either followed or preceded by that manic episode. So again, bipolar 1, kind of the way I remember those, bipolar 1, you just have the one manic episode. Bipolar 2, you have the two different phases. Another related disorder is called cyclothymic disorder. It's kind of like a milder form of bipolar 2, where someone has, kind of manic episodes and kind of depressive disorders, but they're not as extreme as bipolar 2. Sometimes cyclothymic disorder might be, kind of a sign that someone is developing bipolar disorder. So someone with cyclothymic disorder might go on to develop the more extreme versions later. Any questions about symptoms of bipolar disorder? Yeah, Hannah.
During the depressive episode, like how long are they in that state?
Ooh, that's a good question. I don't know off the top of my head. I would guess it has to be that 2 weeks again. Nani probably knows. She's back there watching me. I've got it. She's not teaching now though, so.
It can last anywhere from 2 weeks to 2 years. The depressive episode, you might not see a manic episode for quite a while. Again, years.
Thank you.
True.
All right, so epidemiology refers to basically the prevalence of all these different disorders. So we'll talk about epidemiology every time we talk about a disorder. And there's a couple different ways to kind of quantify prevalence. So for example, 12-month prevalence rate is basically like if right now I went and polled a bunch of people, let's say I found 1,000 people or whatever my population is, and I asked them in the past 12 months, have you suffered from this disorder? So for major depressive disorder, that number is about 7%. I should have checked the date on these numbers. I'm trying to remember when your textbook was last updated. I think it's pretty recent. But if it's prior, if this was updated prior to the pandemic, then those numbers would be probably quite a bit higher at this point. Because during COVID, a lot of psychological disorders shot up, especially things like depressive disorders, anxiety disorders. So that number might be even higher at this point. It tends to be most common in kind of early adulthood from like 18 to 29. And it's twice as high for women compared to men. So women much more likely to suffer from major depressive disorder. And, very sadly, but maybe not surprisingly, people who suffer from MDD are about 17 times more likely to commit suicide compared to the rest of the population, people who have not been diagnosed with major depressive disorder. For bipolar 1, the prevalence is a lot lower, so it's about 1.5% of people in the past 12 months have, had a diagnosis of bipolar 1 disorder. And bipolar 2 is even smaller, so only about 0.8%. There are also gender differences in bipolar as well, so bipolar 2 is more common for women. There's some evidence that things like childbirth can actually trigger manic episodes in some cases, and also depression as well. So that might contribute to that gender difference, but there's probably other causes as well. And again, sadly, with bipolar disorder, there's a very high rate of suicide among people who are diagnosed with this. So about 20 to 30 times the average population, people with bipolar will commit or attempt suicide. All right, so we had a question earlier about comorbidity. So comorbidity refers to a situation where you have someone who's diagnosed with a particular disorder and also has one or more other disorders as well. And that's very common that someone with one psychological disorder is going to suffer from others on top of that. And there seems to be sort of clusters of these disorders. So with major depressive disorder, people who are diagnosed with that are likely to also be diagnosed with substance use disorder. They may also have anxiety disorders, PTSD, OCD, etc. There's a bunch of them listed here. And that probably makes a lot of sense, right? If someone's suffering from one of these other psychological disorders, that may impact their mood in all kinds of ways. One of the difficulties when we're talking about comorbidities is it's very difficult to know, you get a chicken and egg situation. Did one come first and then maybe cause the other? Or do they maybe have some underlying brain chemistry that's shared that's causing both of them? It's often very difficult to kind of make that cause and effect statement. There are also often gender differences with comorbidity as well. So women who suffer from major depressive disorder are more likely to have anxiety and eating disorders. And they may also have somatoform disorders, which is basically where you have a physical disorder that's exacerbated by mental factors, essentially. Men who have major depressive disorder are more likely to suffer from a substance abuse disorder and have that as a comorbidity. Whenever someone has a comorbidity, it can make treatment very difficult because a medication that might help one of the disorders might actually make the other disorder worse. And so that always has to be taken into account whenever treatments are being, when a treatment plan is being developed. And bipolar disorder, you've got some similarities here. So people with bipolar disorder are also likely to suffer from a substance use disorder. They may also suffer from anxiety disorders and ADHD as well. Okay, etiology refers to basically the underlying cause of the disorder. So with all of these, there are a number of factors that contribute. It's not like there's one single cause for any of them, whether it's depressive disorder or bipolar disorder. Often there's going to be multiple factors that have to come together, kind of create a perfect storm in order for someone to be diagnosed with these disorders. So there are often going to be lots of different biological causes that might contribute. So we already talked a little bit on, last time or the time before about genetics. So we know that there is a pretty strong genetic component to both depressive disorders and bipolar disorders. So with depression, identical twins are about 46% likely to share a diagnosis of depressive disorder. If you look at just like regular siblings, that overlap is about 20%. So there's kind of that 26% difference between identical twins and siblings. So that suggests right there's a pretty strong genetic component that's contributing to depression. For bipolar, it's even larger. So with bipolar disorder, depending on which study you look at, it's anywhere between 75% and 90% overlap between identical twins. So bipolar disorder has a very strong genetic component to it. In addition to genetics, there may be some biochemical imbalances going on. So kind of the common running theory, especially with depression, is that there are disruptions in serotonin, but there may also be disruptions in norepinephrine. I do want to say, so that's kind of been the running theory for a really long time, and sort of common knowledge that serotonin imbalances cause depression. There's been quite a few recent sort of called meta-analyses. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that approach, but a meta-analysis is basically where someone takes all the studies that they can find on a particular topic and kind of pool all the data together and look at it to see if findings from different studies are robust, are they repeatable. And a lot of those recent meta-analyses have actually found that theory about serotonin might not be accurate, that there might not actually be a relationship between serotonin levels and depression, which is, it's kind of difficult to sort out issues like that. We talked, I think, last time about the idea of how these neurotransmitter systems are very complex. And so it's very difficult sometimes to get a clear picture of what's going on when we're talking about neurotransmitters and chemicals in the nervous system. But the interesting thing is that we know that medications that target serotonin help alleviate depression symptoms. So there's still a lot of questions, I would say, about the role that neurotransmitters play in the cause of depression, but that's been kind of the running theory, is usually lack of serotonin or norepinephrine will contribute to these disorders. We might talk about that more in a second when we talk about treatment, we'll see. In addition to genetics and biochemical imbalances, another biological cause are disruptions in the endocrine system. The endocrine system are basically your glands that secrete different hormones. So hormones have effects on your entire body in lots of different ways. And so if there are disruptions in that hormone system, then that can lead to some of the symptoms of depression. Some of the likely hormones that might cause depression specifically are cortisol and melatonin. So melatonin you might be familiar with, that's the hormone that's released basically as it starts to get dark outside, and then as it builds up you get tired. So there's some suggestion that at least some of the sleep disturbances, the lack of motivation, the fatigue that comes with depression might be due to imbalances in melatonin. And then cortisol is a hormone that's released mostly during your stress response, but also imbalances in cortisol may also contribute to depression as well. I'll say too with the endocrine system, there's another kind of chicken and egg situation though. We're not really sure is it the imbalance in hormones that cause the depressive symptoms, Or is it someone who has depression and maybe isn't eating well, they're not sleeping right because of the depression, maybe that causes an imbalance in their hormones. So again, there's kind of a difficulty untangling the cause and effect there. And then the last kind of biological cause is also brain anatomy. So not just, at the neurotransmitter level, but there also might be disruptions in like the entire systems. They might have, particular areas of the brain that are, smaller or larger than they should be or than they are in the normal population that can also contribute to some of these symptoms. In addition to all of those biological causes, there also might be more like cognitive or psychological causes going on as well. So for example, learned helplessness is basically where someone has been in a situation where they could not help themselves. Maybe something traumatic was happening to them and they had no control over the situation. They may then basically learn to not respond whenever a trauma or a stress happens that they could have control over. So I'll give you an example. One of the researchers that kind of discovered learned helplessness did experiments with dogs to kind of establish what this phenomenon was. It's very sad to talk about, but basically what they did, they took some dogs, they put them in a cage where the floor would shock them. And the one set of dogs, they had them in this cage where they could not escape, so the floor is just shocking them and there's absolutely nothing they can do about it. The other set of dogs, they were fine, they weren't shocked or anything like that, they were just kind of left alone. They took all the dogs then and put them in another cage where one side of the floor would shock them, and then there's kind of just this small barrier that they could like easily jump over to get to another side of the cage that's safe. And they found the dogs that had been in that cage where they couldn't escape before, if you now put them in the cage where they could escape, they don't try to. They just lay down in the corner and cry basically and don't do anything to help themselves. Whereas the ones who were not, that didn't go through that treatment, as soon as the floor starts shocking them, they immediately jump over the barrier and escape. So that's kind of the principle of learned helplessness. If you're put in a situation where there's stress and there's trauma and you cannot control, which may happen during childhood, right? If you're a young child, horrible things are happening to you and you can't do anything about it because you're a kid, then you might develop this kind of learned helplessness where now as an adult, things that, stressors and things that come at you, you might just kind of like give up, basically. So that's one possible psychological cause that might lead to depressive symptoms. Another is what's called attributional style, which is basically kind of the story we tell ourselves about what causes issues in our lives. So if something, good happens, do we take credit for it? Do we think that we're the cause of it, or do we think that we're just lucky and the world let that thing happen to us? Same thing if something bad happens to us. Do we think that it's all our fault and we're terrible, or do we think like, oh, I just had, some bad luck here? So attributional style has also been shown to at least correlate with depression. So people who suffer from depression typically will have an attributional style where they think that good things that happen to them are luck and the bad things that happen to them are all their fault, essentially. Maladaptive attitudes, that's kind of similar to attributional styles, but basically where people have just very negative thought patterns, negative beliefs about, not just the things that happen to them, but about who they are as a person, etc. And sometimes those thoughts can be very automatic. So the person might not necessarily have control over them. They just kind of come up, automatically without any conscious effort or control. Any questions about possible causes of depression? And again, I just want to reiterate, probably someone who's suffering from depression, they may have, multiple of these factors that come together all at once. Okay. So for treatment, for major depressive disorder and persistent depressive disorder, typically one of the most common treatments is going to be medical antidepressants. I have a few examples of sort of traditional antidepressants here. So the first are called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs. So let's kind of break down what that word means. So serotonin, we already know, that's a neurotransmitter that I already talked about that we think is playing a role in depression. It's very important for things like mood and social interaction. Reuptake, if you remember, we talked about this very briefly, I think, when we were talking about like neurons and their anatomy. So if you remember, whenever a neuron sort of spits out neurotransmitter into the synapse, it then has to be cleaned up somehow. And there's all kinds of mechanisms to do that. One is reuptake. That's the one where the neuron sort of vacuums that neurotransmitter back up inside of it. So inhibitor then means that we're stopping that process. So with an SSRI, basically what it's doing is that whenever the neuron spits out the serotonin, it's going to stop reuptake. So now the serotonin is hanging out in the synapse for longer, so it can basically activate the next neuron in the chain, more frequently and more than it normally would, because it's kind of spending more time out there in the synapse. So essentially, it's increasing serotonin activity is like the big picture thing that SSRIs are doing. So again, the fact that SSRIs help alleviate depression is one of the pieces of evidence that led us to believe that maybe serotonin plays a role in depressive symptoms. Tricyclic antidepressants, they're kind of similar. They work on not just serotonin, but also norepinephrine. Norepinephrine, so it's essentially adrenaline is basically what norepinephrine is. So it's what helps keep us sort of awake, aroused, and high levels of attention. And so tricyclic antidepressants, they work similarly to SSRIs, but they're going to target serotonin and norepinephrine both. Monoamine oxidase inhibitors, or MAOIs, again, very similar. They basically, so another process that can clean up the neurotransmitter in the synapse is that you have different enzymes that'll come and eat up those neurotransmitters, kind of break them down to their constituent parts that they were before. And monoamine oxidase is one of those enzymes that breaks down things like serotonin and norepinephrine. So again, a monoamine oxidase inhibitor is going to stop that process. So end result is kind of similar to the SSRI, it's just doing it through a slightly different mechanism. Now I should say all of these have different side effects. They can cause things like dry mouth. They can sometimes cause cardiovascular issues. They can even affect vision. They can cause sexual dysfunction. There's a whole list of side effects that come from taking these antidepressants. In addition to medication, there's also things like cognitive behavioral therapy, which we already talked about quite a bit. So again, the idea there is that you're trying to identify problematic thought patterns and change those thought patterns, replace them with something more positive. Also making changes to your behaviors through things like conditioning, changing up the environment. That can also help alleviate depressive symptoms as well. Interpersonal therapy is working on relationships. So sometimes these depressive symptoms can be caused by issues in the family or with your spouse or with your kids. So interpersonal therapy is another type of psychotherapy that's often used in treating depression. Any questions about depression treatment? And again, in just a minute after we finish this PowerPoint, we'll talk a little bit about the podcast you listened to about how hallucinogens might be used as a treatment, but we'll save that for just a little bit. Oh, I forgot I had this here. There's also another recent study I read that said that exercising for 150 minutes a week for 4 weeks straight can actually alleviate depressive symptoms at about the same level as taking SSRIs or other medications. So there's pretty good evidence that just exercising, even having a healthy diet, sleeping well, all those things can help alleviate depression. Now, of course, the issue there is if you're depressed, are you going to have the motivation to get up and go exercise 150 minutes a week for 4 weeks straight? That's probably going to be very difficult. But it might help prevent depression, and if you have someone who maybe is starting out taking, medical antidepressants, and that helps them, sort of get rid of some of those symptoms, get some motivation so they can start exercising, then maybe eventually you can wean them off of those antidepressants if they can maintain, a good exercise regime and good diet and all of that. Yes, Ryan.
Is that because it releases dopamine?
So part of it, there's probably all kinds of things that this is contributing to. One of them is that yes, exercise releases dopamine and endorphins, which help at a neurochemical level help us feel pleasure basically. But it also probably then fixes a bunch of other things as well. Like if you're not physically healthy, then it may be harder to get up and do the things that you want to do throughout the day. If you're exercising and you get healthier, that'll be easier. If you're exercising, you'll be able to sleep better at night, right? There's probably a ton of things that exercise is doing that helps decrease depressive symptoms. Any other questions so far about treating depression or anything else? Okay. For bipolar disorder, some of the medications that are used are lithium and Depakote. I don't have as much detail about what exactly those are doing, but essentially they help stabilize mood. They may occasionally be combined with antidepressants, although that can be tricky. If someone who has bipolar disorder is taking an antidepressant, sometimes that can trigger a manic episode or increase the likelihood of a manic episode. And then, of course, psychotherapy can be used as well, although psychotherapy, typically isn't going to be effective by itself in treating bipolar disorder. They're almost always going to need to take some kind of medication. All right. Any questions about depression or bipolar disorder? Okay. Then we can go ahead and shift to our discussion. So just very quickly to kind of summarize the podcast that, again, all of you hopefully listened to. It was talking all about how hallucinogens, mostly specifically psilocybin, can be used to treat depression. So psilocybin is a chemical that's found in mushrooms. I'm just going to very briefly talk about this just to kind of summarize and jog your memory, because I'm going to have you discuss it in just a second. You may remember that it talked about this idea of like ego dissolution and how that might contribute. I don't remember if it said this in the podcast or if this is something I pulled from the book that the podcast is based on, but it's been shown that one dose, if you do like a full dose, can be effective for up to 6 months to a year. So someone who's suffering from depression or some of those other issues that they talked about in the podcast would only have to do it, maybe once or twice a year. You can also microdose. That's another approach. Again, I can't remember if the podcast talked about that in detail. But microdosing regularly is basically where you take such a small dose that you're not actually hallucinating. It just kind of causes like increased maybe vividness of colors and things like that. But microdosing on a regular basis may also help symptoms as